All right, welcome everybody to the March 7th meeting of the Finance and Legal Guild for the Lifeboat Academy. And as is our custom, we start by doing a land acknowledgement, and I pause to make space for anyone who would like to try their hand at doing a land acknowledgement. And one of the things on our agenda at the Lifeboat Academy is to create a simple checklist for a land acknowledgement as training wheels so that people can practice. And so that will be forthcoming. And in the meantime, I will channel Norm Leach again and say we start by acknowledging the land because the land was here before we were, and the land will be here long after we are gone. And the land, we are only here as people because the land caused us to be. And everything that we do, everything that we experience, everything that we need to thrive and survive comes from the land and returns to the land. And when we say the land, we mean more than lines on a map. We are talking about the land as a living organism that encompasses us and all of our relations and all of that interconnected web of being that is our mutual survival system. And so we put that at the front of our meetings to remind us that everything that we do here is actually part of a bigger picture and that we are always interconnected and interdependent. And in the end, this is a call to action to find ways to be in right relations with ourself and all of our relations. So all of our human relations, all of us here individually and together, and also with our more than human relations. And it is a call to be mindful that harms can happen. And when harms happen, that it's our duty to heal the harms to the best of our ability, to respond where we can, to be responsible. And in leaning into all of this, we also acknowledge a deep debt of gratitude to the indigenous cultures of the world who have discovered and rediscovered and maintained this knowledge and through their generosity pass it on to us at a time when our culture desperately needs to remember this interconnection. Um, and I am minded of on Tuesday, we had an anti-oppression workshop here on the farm. And I am called to make explicit, I think we are all on the same page that this is about mutual liberation and a recognition that none of us can be free if any of us are oppressed. And our well-being is dependent on the well-being of everyone in our network. And so how can we all learn to be healthy and well together? So with that in mind, let's just do a little bit of a check-in. And anyone have a check-in question? Keep it light and breezy. We just did the weather. So actually, let's of course we're talking about all our relations. So I'm wondering who is or who in the human or more than human sense are relations that have made themselves have brought themselves to your attention recently. And the circle as I see it is Heather, Roland, Becca, and me. So over to you, Heather. Check in with what relations are getting your attention lately?
So I feel the tears coming up in the back of my eyes, which means that I'm really conscious. And the relationship that comes up for me is my grandson Gerhard, who's going through a pretty rough time. And I spent yesterday, my daughter and I, helping him move from one uh, bedroom to another in the cooperative where he was at and what he really loved. And now he's feeling a deep sense of loneliness and like many of us, and like certainly like me, kind of an overwhelm about what's happening externally and how to kind of relate to that. And also, as you know, you might have remembered Ben a little bit about his own competency, which
Mhm.
he's kind of a bit shaky on. And I want to kind of connect up with you another time about that because I have some ideas on how maybe I could ask you for some support in that. But yeah, it's like I mean, the sensitivity, I think, to what's going on. And if I can just add one more line for myself, um, I had to hang up on my daughter who was just raging at me because I was so naive and I wasn't accepting reality and I was just in denial and whatever. And so I just hung up on her, and it was the first time I've ever done that, ever in my life done that on her. And then it caused me to think about, well, am I really like in denial? No, I think I'm not in denial, right? But then again, it's kind of like, and I don't want to be obsessed. I don't want to go down the obsession route. Um, but then I thought, where am I getting my information from? And is it reliable? And what do I know? I mean, other people know so much more than me. So I did this crazy thing. I signed up to TikTok. And then I got the algorithms that just gave me just the comedians that were supporting Canada and anti-Trump. And it was kind of like, oh, wow, we've got this movement happening, guys. This is great. And then I thought, I am getting this because somebody is selecting this information for me to get. What are they getting in America?
Mhm.
And then I went and I don't even know how I did it, but I started to listening to some of the things that are being broadcast to Americans. And I was shocked at the level of AI and disinformation. So, I mean, I didn't, I said I would make this very brief and I didn't. But anyway, this is where I'm at right now. I'm not sure. I'm just holding that in consciousness. I'm not sure where it's going for me, but I am questioning my own source of information too, as well. And I love it that I'm in this circle with three of you. You know, such high level of consciousness and intention and intelligence and everything else that can be supportive, uh, to how we, I don't know, stick handle this or whatever it is we're required to do. Whew, that was a big check-in. And I've forgotten who it's now. Is it you?
Roland.
Is it you, Roland? Yeah.
Um, well, the relations that are most evident to me today in the moment are my green relations as I start to re-engage with um, growing them. So engaging in all sorts of experiments again, trying to wrap my head around the difference between the East and West Coast growing and all of the extra possibilities that here because of the growing zones and watching my little cosmos seedlings start to up their little dicotyledon heads and yeah, and contrasting that sort of grounding experience with everything else that's happening in the world and and trying to use that as a counterbalance in the also andness of what it means to be a living creature. Um, so uh, over to Becca.
Thank you. I'm sure I'm in some denial because otherwise I don't know how I would be moving forward. Like a certain amount, how do you drive unless you're in denial of A, that you could die instantly at any moment, and B, the fossil fuels that are being consumed. Anyway, I the relations that came to mind when you asked that question, Ben, were little people, young humans that I'm in relationship to. Ami, who's 18 months, who I spend time with once a week when we're both in town, and got to take her to the swimming pool on Tuesday. And then for an extra treat, my neighbors in co-housing, um, who have a 4-year-old and now a 3-month-old, asked me if I had a couple hours on Thursday afternoon to spend with their 3-month-old, and I said, yes, I'll make that happen. Even though we have birds nesting in our stove vent, I think, and I had a repair guy coming to like see if there's any way to get a ladder up the, I don't know, 2.5 stories with landscaping underneath. Like, anyway, I don't know how we're gonna get that repaired, but and I had the baby with me while I was looking at the bird nests, and so those are my relations that I'm thinking about the most the last day or so, and yeah, the world. A lot of the people in my life, a lot of the adults in my life are feeling down right now, and it's I'm feeling that way a little bit too right now, although I'm trying to like gear up for canvassing for the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court race that we have an election for in on April 1st, and Elon Musk and the other, you know, oligarchs are pouring tons of money in to try to win that race, and we're just putting foot leather in. So shoe leather, I guess, is the expression. Over to you, Ben.
So Heather, yes to any conversation about Gerhardt, and I'm sorry that he's having some challenges. And so if there's a way I can be supportive, then count me in. And ditto, I think around I mean, this is kind of a daily conversation in our house about how do you manage where is that balance point between awareness and overwhelm, and that's that's a major chunk of resilience, is figuring out what's yours and what's not yours, and how to be aware without being drawn under by it. And I think a constantly moving target. And I kind of agree with you, Becca. I think there's some level of denial and delusion that is just required, for and I guess it's not really denial or delusion. It's just like there are things that are beyond my control, and that may impact me, and that I have no power over, like I can shape things, I can influence things, I can try to stack the deck in my favor, and but there's just stuff going on right now that is beyond Heather, like, I love your expression, it's just beyond any of our pay grades. And I think it's beyond anybody's pay grade. I think even though there are lots of people who are trying to wield a lot of power plays, I think it's all just so complex systems are complex systems, and they're not easily steered. But the relations that have made themselves known to me recently, this has been over the last couple of days, are the birds. And in particular, there's just so much bird song outside. And it makes me wish that I knew better how to identify all the different bird songs. And there's some that I'm familiar with, and there's some that are unfamiliar to me. And I'm wondering, are they just passing through, or, um, so yeah, the birds have been calling, and I wish I knew how to, how to say hi better. more specifically. So, yeah, well, and I have one that's with the bird calls, but there was I heard this one call when I was walking Zelda, and it was really distinctive. And I had my phone out, and I was waiting, and it didn't do it again. And it's like, ah. Anyhow, um, so yeah, and the speaking of the world um and what we can do, let's talk bylaws. So what I was thinking about is so we've all had we were either at the meeting or we had a chance to listen to the recording. And what I thought as a first chunk of time is that we would just go around and do kind of what are your takeaways? And I was thinking about doing it gathering consideration style, which for us means kind of one point at a time, but we'll do multiple rounds. So rather than doing a laundry list of everything that you're noticing, like what's one of your takeaways, or one either a question or something that you observed, or a thought that has popped up in response to the information, and we'll just kind of build that up until it feels like, oftentimes we find that we go around a few times, and there's just a natural point where we kind of feel like, okay, we've got that out, and oftentimes there's a sort of a next step that starts to present itself, but we can let that emerge as it will. So does that sound like a reasonable starting point? Okay. So Heather, over to you, and I will bring up the notes and take notes as we're talking. So over to you, Heather.
Okay, so my first takeaway was thank you, Rebecca, for suggesting that we have this meeting. I know that I was questioning whether or not our lawyers were aligned with our purpose, and whether or not they were, um, creative enough for us. And I was just so delighted to find out how aligned they were, and how much they understood that they were in that kind of creative process of taking our values and then seeing how they actually could be interpreted and aligned to what we were able to do here in British Columbia. So, you know, right on, and full marks for all of that. And this is pretty exciting. The second takeaway for me was I began to think, okay, I think it's what you were saying, Ben, or maybe it was Roland. I don't know who to attribute it to, but I mean, we all kind of, I think, share this, and that this is a model. This is if we do this, this will be useful to other people. And in Foodlands, I mean, who would this be useful to? This is useful to Abundance Farm, who needs to somehow financially figure out how to take that out of private ownership. This would be useful to Salt Spring, who again is wants to take this out of private ownership. This would be useful to the Gibson Farm, who again we want to take out of private ownership. And we need mechanisms to do that. So those two, those two takeaways are really strong for me without getting into nitty gritty. And over to Roland.
Yeah, I likewise, I felt like we that I felt like there was a lot that we have been saying in different ways for a while had been heard. And that I felt like the either implicitly or explicitly understood that we were discontent with the rendement, what is that in English? Well,
Understanding, or
Google Translate at some point.
yeah.
Yeah, and sort of an engagement or re-engagement, or I felt like there was much more of an exchange of ideas instead of a telling you know, this is, you can do this, you can't do that. And the very fact that at the end they took the time to say that they were interested in the innovation that we're proposing with these ideas. So that was comforting to hear. And yeah, over to you, Becca.
Yeah, I think I felt a sense of relief with the meeting, and
Yeah.
really the engagement and the creativity, but also just the expertise, you know, like I feel like we've been sort of mucking around in the dark, and somebody says, well, you know, I have a light, you know, and and also like specifically around the worries about alienating investors with too long of a buyout time period or whatever. Like it feels like things just got simplified a lot. Like, oh, just tell people it's 10 years so that then they can't, you know, be upset. And um and also the thing that you don't have to, if you don't have the money, you don't have to redeem a share. Like if it's going to make you insolvent, you don't have to redeem a membership. Like that's
Huge.
news to me and seems super helpful to what we're trying to accomplish. So over to Ben.
Yeah, ditto all around. It made me, I felt like it was a further confirmation of the power of relational work. Um, and Becca, I want to credit you with, you know, putting it out there. We weren't walking our talk because we were getting all tight. I was getting tight about money. And so I think this was, you know, once again, lean into the relationship and make sure that that works. And so, you know, good on us for, you know, collectively coming back to that ground. And and I agree, I'm excited. And likewise, I felt the same. So I got a bunch of dittos because I also felt like there were like key bits of information that were like, oh, you know, like, okay, this is including like we had that the debate about whether or not the board should have approval of a sale of the shares. And actually, it's kind of a requirement. My understanding now is like that's a requirement. You know, we don't get the exemption unless the board has that kind of authority. And yeah, so there were lots of little like, oh, okay. Um, and so yeah, I really appreciated and I think, you know, I don't feel like we had a lot of wasted effort. I think that, you know, we kind of had to stumble around in the dark long enough to know what we didn't know to be able to understand what their answer was. So, you know, putting some of those things in context. Um, Yeah, I think that's for my first share. I'll keep it with that, and we'll just keep going. And so, you know, part of gathering considerations is we can build on. You can respond to something else that you've heard, or you can add a new point, a new takeaway. We'll just keep building, and again, try to hold it to one point at a time, and we'll layer it up. So back over to you, Heather.
Yeah. Okay. So perhaps my one point is to, okay, my observation or whatever it is, what I was hearing, and is that corporations really protect themselves. So a good thing in terms of the law is that if we see us in that respect, we are protecting the whole. If we see ourselves as kind of in that corporate protection space. So people can't bring us down. And I think that, and I guess the other thing too is that I feel that these lawyers are very excited about working with us to make sure that our values are intact, and that if we go back to those values and just double check on that, okay, how does it affect this and that, so that we see, like, for example, the board is the general guiding circle or whatever it is that we call our board, and it is made up of all of the influences and the consent of all the other circles under it, then we're not actually isolating and having a board that's disconnected with the base. So I'm pretty excited about us kind of getting kind of right down in the weeds on this and just looking at how does this flow. And not only for us, but Ben, for Foodlands too as well. This is so reciprocal to me. Yeah, over to Roland.
Well, something that's jumping out at me from what you've been saying, Heather, is how this is useful for other farms and other organizations already that you can name. And it makes me curious about um, uh, is there room for involvement or support from any of these other organizations and farms that we can already see benefiting from this, and in terms of our ask, what could that look like? What would that be? Um, uh, yeah, because I probably stating the obvious, I could see real benefit to working even more relationally in working with other places that um, could be impacted by whatever it is that we accomplish here. So that's what's standing out to me. It's not so much about the meeting, but more about what's coming out in these considerations. Um, in terms of the meeting, I thought it was interesting that there were things that, and I feel I'd like to have a timeline of what's happened with the way that the bylaws are written, because I feel like there were some things that were in there that were removed that now are being put back in, or suggested to be put back in, or vice versa. So I'm just curious about what that sort of organic um, process has been so far in the shaping of the bylaws. So over to Becca.
I think I have a question about whether we still feel like we need a conclave of other lawyers or not. Or whether we just, feel confident enough right now that we could dig, really dig in with them and finish something up, which I'm feeling more optimistic about, and wondering what you all think about that. Ben.
Yeah, it's an interesting balancing act. I still feel like it would be beneficial and to have, well, and I'm seeing this maybe morph a little bit from what Roland is saying. So that rather than a lawyer's conclave, it could just be, like a interested parties conclave to talk to other farms who might be considering something like this. I know John at Salt Spring, I still have to respond to him, but in response to the email that I sent out about, are you interested in this research project? He basically wrote back and said, we're thinking, they're developing some bylaws right now for an economic model that's trying to do what we're trying to do. And so I think they also are at the level of they've got bylaws that they're looking at and they're thinking about, what to do with them. And so I feel like in terms of creating a better quality product, it's always anything can be a tool and a weapon, and it's always about balance. But I feel like getting some more feedback from people that have a very similar goal in mind could be helpful, but in a way that doesn't, I don't want to start over, right? It's not about kind of going back to square one, but if there's a way, and I'm thinking also, I know Heather and I are, there's this event that was going to happen next week and now it's going to happen in April, but actually seems like a great opportunity to do exactly what we're talking about. I think I've got a spot on the agenda if I want it, and we could actually use that as kind of presenting, here's our case study, and it's going to be a collection of people who are thinking about land trusts and food land trusts, and so very, very aligned folk. And I think it's also really important. This comes back to the global, the state of the world right now. I feel like how quick can we get something? Time feels like it's of the essence. And so, how can we proceed quickly and also make space for gathering good perspectives? So my answer is it's, yes, and both, and that's where I'd come down on that. Devil's in the details, I guess, about how to do it in a way that is helpful and doesn't take us off track. So let's just keep going. I feel like we're still talking. There's still a lot of good stuff coming up. So Heather, over to you.
Yeah, and I guess for me it's and. So let me just ground myself in how many ands do I want to introduce here. Yes, Ben, to us discussing it through the Salt Spring group. I'd say yes to interested parties. Yes to maybe some of the lawyers we've identified already that are actually connected to us in Foodlands and the network we have, which would be Lori and Blueberry Commons Cooperative, and would be Ian Moore, who was on the board of Foodlands, and we never really found a place where he could be a reciprocal place for him after we actually engaged him with the Law Foundation Access to Land Guide that we created with him. And he is working with Indigenous people now. I think that he might be very interested in finding out what's been happening down in Madison, right, with the lawyer there that you've connected with, Rebecca. So I'm just exploding all over with all of this and trying to figure out how do we put it together. The other piece of it, I think, is that on the 21st of March is the deadline for a new Law Foundation grant. And I have been connecting up with the National Farmers Union and Foundation about Foodlands going together for some kind of legal research grant. I don't think we're quite ready for this yet, and yet the deadline is coming up. So we've got some meetings happening. I don't know, I can't remember, Ben, whether you were part of that, whether I even emailed you or CC'd you on part of that, but we need to form this grant. What is our ask? And there's a lot of this that could be an ask. Like with the Law Foundation, it looks like now they are expanding beyond just actually paying for lawyers to doing research and education and all kinds of other things too as well. So, but mostly when we got the grant before, it paid for lawyers. So I just think that this is incredibly useful. And maybe we don't have to roll this all into one project within the next like week or something, maybe, but maybe we can go for more than one grant. And I think that, yeah, anyway, those are my thoughts. They're just going bing, 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 not necessarily coalescing, but they're just putting out, as I guess, considerations. And Roland.
Yeah, and so and also, but I'm thinking that it's actually also a reframing. So when I first proposed the idea of going outside of the current lawyers that we have was to get a second opinion. And now it feels like it's not really about getting a second opinion. I'm feeling much more confident about their perspective and their engagement. Um, and I think it is something that could be really useful to be able to really get into, to be thorough, different perspectives. And I like the idea of presenting and bringing in people from other organizations. And then there's also, so doing all of that will mean potentially more effort and energy. So that's something to keep in mind. And then there's also the question of timing, because we also, we were hoping that all of this would be done many, many moons ago, and that this is the piece that we're waiting for to go to return into a more solid um, uh, uh, place to be able to get people to engage and to be part of buying this property. So that's part of the push and pull that I feel about going larger and bringing in more stuff and more people, and the question of the timing to be able to actually just get this place. So considerations, those are considerations. I don't have to have a solution. I can just, these are just considerations. There you go. Over to Becca.
I feel like one of the things that one of them said near the end was referred to negotiations with potential investors. And we talked about having, like a draft that we then take to, what was the guy's name? I don't even remember.
Joey.
Joey. Sorry, there's another Joey in my life, so I'm confused. And so I feel like it would be good to have to get that soon, get a draft soon if we still want to do that. And I think there's some, I don't want to call it negotiations, but some restorative work to do with Don, my husband, between Ben and him, that I've talked to Ben a little bit about, that would be good to sort of not get too far on the back burner if we're hoping for any additional funds from from me and him, or more than I can come up with on my own. And this is maybe that's a separate consideration, and I've just given you two, and I'm about to give you a third, which is I'm still confused about people from the US investing and what that, like, so I want that to be on the list of things we ask the lawyers about. Like, do they know the answer? Like, show them the stuff from our accountant and say, is this really going to be an undue burden on Lifeboat to have to do all this yada yada? And so we should really just be doing loans instead of investment if it's from the US. Yeah, I'll stop there. Over to Ben.
This seemed, it was a point that I wanted to make, and I feel like it's relevant here as well. Or the one thing that really struck me was the 50-person thing, the 50 investors. And I feel like it's a limitation that could actually be advantageous if we think about how, if we really wanted to limit these to 50 investors. First of all, it makes me think that joint membership or whatever, like, I'm totally switched now. So we definitely want to allow joint membership, because then that makes it easier to, rather than a couple being two investors, they become one investor. So that would help with making sure that we could fit within the numbers. But I feel like that kind of constraint actually makes this in a way more manageable. That we're and I guess it's, kind of thinking about how the numbers might work and who could invest. And so I think there's a question about the community support. But basically, if we have, the way that I'm seeing our current share structure, we have the A, B, and C. And A is basically people that are putting in financial investment, and B are people that are putting in labor investment. And we have it structured so you can invest in both. You can buy A class and B class, and that would also, I think, mean the total number of investors, would still work within that 50. And I think I'm coming back to kind of conceptually, we need to be able to tell the story of the bylaws in a simple way. And I think part of that simplicity is there are, we recognize investment, not just in financial investment, but also in labor investment. And then the way that it's structured, that puts like Heather, you were saying, if we have the board set up the right way, in a way, we are kind of kicking some challenges down the road, but it is in essence saying, okay, here we all are. Some people have more financial means, some people are contributing more effort, some people have a direct stake, some people have a less direct stake. What feels fair in terms, and that's the other thing, as a social enterprise, we need to pay the bills and we hope to generate some profit. And when we do, how does that get distributed? And then the group has to make a choice about how that happens. But the process is really quite simple, right? First you pay off your creditors, and then you decide how much goes to future funds. And then of the surplus, how does that get distributed between the people who are doing the work and the people that have the financial investment? And so that's all kind of normal stuff, right? Like that doesn't need to get encoded. That's just how an organization works. And we don't have to make those decisions ahead of time. We don't even know if we'll be making money, kind of thing. So I think what I'm saying, I think I'm agreeing that as part of that reframing, we should have something like a draft that we go and say, here's the draft and here's what we think the simple version is. And then we can get responses from potential investors. And And I think the other thing in terms that also means I am wondering if we put right up front in the bylaws a value statement around, you know, kind of what we have in that email, you know, the case study of we want to make sure that nobody is making a financial profit at the cost of the sustainability of the land or the people involved. And we just put that right up front. And then, you know, once there is some sort of financial return, we decide collectively what's the most effective use of that money. And everyone's at the table and we have to have those conversations. And we can just, I think, you know, just making it clear that I think my fear is always that generally people who put the money in want no risk and all return. You know, like the risk ends up being borne on other people's shoulders to guarantee the financial return. And I think that's what we want to make sure, that everyone shares the risk and everyone shares the return. And and that may not be anything that we have to put in the bylaws other than like as a sort of a value statement, not as a process or, you know, some sort of formula. And I think the point that I think the point I'm trying to make is I think it's a both and in terms of getting something that is as close to done as possible. So the conclave is not, we don't wait to have something final for the conclave or whatever that turns out to be, but we say, here's the model that we think we're presenting. How would you make it better? You know, is there anything that you could do to make it better here? Anyhow, those are just some thoughts. Over to you, Heather.
Yeah. So first of all, when I look at all these considerations, it's not towards delaying the process for us. I think I would want to move forward as quickly as we possibly can. And then what we have is a model that we can share with other people. So that, like, just separating that two, like, we could go on forever if we're trying to bring all this new information in. We're not bringing new information as much as we're sharing our process with other people. And that there are opportunities to do that. And maybe this is too specific, but for example, we're committed in Foodlands to do some kind of land presentation in November at Organic BC. So that might be something that we do like as a roundtable discussion or whatever. I mean, my imagination is going zip, 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 but I do want to kind of focus in on what we're going to do. Now, I have a question for you, Ben and Roland, particularly. What are we looking at now? We're not doing a community service co-op because that isn't aligned with what we want to do. Are we a corporation? Are we a B Corp? Are we a society? What are we?
It's still a co-op. So
Okay.
currently, and actually this is another thing to kind of talk through. We tried to, originally we were talking about maybe even having 3 different organizations. And then we thought, well, let's just try to see if we can do one or where would we start? And I think what has come from this for me is we may need at least 2. We may need a community services co-op that I think is the education part of the Lifeboat Academy, and then a regular old co-op that is the property and it's, you know, and it's the social enterprise model.
Okay, so that's really clear to me, and I'm really familiar with that. And I live on a farm which is two co-ops, and we and that model is being uh, it applies to also as well to other co-ops. And I agree. We did this with in Nanaimo. We did this with um, Salt Spring. It's kind of like, because there are two purposes. One is to hold the land, one is land based, and the other is program people based. if that's not a good way of differentiating. But and then that is in terms of food lands, that's just parallel to what we're doing. We're wanting to decommoditize and create a commons, which is the whole legal land piece of it. But at the same time, we want to create community around how we actually relate to the land, like how we support it, how we live on it, how we grow on it. And I think I just want to also reemphasize that one of the overarching purposes is this too, to be place-based, community-based, and food security, food sovereignty based. So we're not creating a kind of a spa kind of thing for wealthy people, and the food is kind of incidental, and we might grow a little futzy things and a few herbs and stuff like that, but we're going to import everything else from Costco. Well, not Costco, but Cisco. And I'm exaggerating, but I'm exaggerating based on real experience, actually.
Mhm.
So, yeah, let's move forward. And yeah, and just that I am fairly confident. It's just like we've got a lawyer in Calgary who's familiar with Alberta law and one who's familiar with that kind of law in the United States. So I just would ask them as to who do they reference when they need to check in with BC, and do they have that kind of skill themselves or that experience themselves? That's all. Roland.
Uh, there's so much stuff. I can't just comment on one thing. I can't do that anymore. Uh, One of them is that I'm really glad that we're coming back to one of the original purposes of having Bill and Elliot as a US based and a Canada based lawyer in terms of how does money resources cross borders, and what are the regulations around that. So I think it's really good that we remember that, and it definitely is something that to bring to the fore with them, because it's an answer that we need. Um, in terms of the sort of the shift that's happening in the share structure, in having two people having one share, I think yes, and keeping the fair share footprint. That's still something I think that is important to the model and to the research that's involved in the Lifeboat Academy. And I think we've talked about this, but I can't remember if there was a conclusion around the timeshare croppers and the number of people who, and I'd love to find a word other than investor, engaged, and engaged people, as the term I'm proposing to use. Uh, so if we're talking about 50 engaged people, what does that mean in terms of the timeshare cropper idea? There may be I don't know if there's some clarification or some thinking through to do around that. And in terms of balancing risk and return, I think I'm more sort of calling forward something that's maybe not being said explicitly, but the risk and return, is actually balancing privilege, or access to privilege, or privilege. And it makes me think, and I'm doing that in the spirit of Vanessa Andriotti. Earlier during the check-in, Becca was pointing out fossil fuels and using this technology and stuff. And one of the things I really appreciate in the opening that Vanessa Andriotti did for the session that I went to was that she called out, just acknowledging that we are using technologies that are ultimately harmful, And in the same way that we're talking about exchanging, and the phrase that we've started to use is exchanging privilege for connection. So I just wanted to call that out. And last but not all, as my alarm is ringing in the background, model to share for continued. Oh yes, thank you, Heather, for talking about wanting to talk to lawyers and to other organizations is not to slow us down, and that we can still move forward and do this as quickly as possible, and that we can present a model, and that presenting the model that we've come up with is in keeping with the whole AMAC Reflect idea, that this is what we've got, and we're offering it up for to be part of a process of continual improvement. So what improvements can you bring to it? What kind of reflection can we bring from our experience of living it that can then help the next iteration to be better, if such a thing exists? There. I think I talked about all the things I wanted to talk about. So over to Becca.
I feel like we need to get to the list of things we said we were gonna talk amongst ourselves about before the next meeting with the lawyers, which is only a month away, and we only have half an hour today, and then our next meeting in the books to cover a lot of things. And I want to make sure that added to that list is the question the lawyers raised for us about do the founders want to retain any greater rights or protections, or be a separate class somehow? Because I feel like they were basically saying, you decide what you want and we can make it happen. But that there's some deep values questions in that. Over to Ben.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have the notes from the last meeting up off to the side here, so I was looking through what are the things that we wanted to talk to, and most of them are, I think, they may even be done right now. So we've got a question about geographic region that feels pretty insignificant in my mind. Joint membership, I think we have a yes, but we want to make sure that it doesn't compromise the fair share idea. The share transfer thing that was actually answered in our conversation, that the board, it was, do we want to let the board have a say in share transfers? And we have to, if we're going to keep the exemption. And then meeting notices, basically what's our limit with how many days advance notice do we want to put officially in the bylaws? So those were the kind of like internal conversations without the lawyer. And then the more complex issues were, is there any way of maintaining community services status while allowing for investment? And I am proposing that the way we handle that is that we have two organizations, one that becomes a community services co-op, and one that is the economic driver of it. So that's how we handle that, rather than trying to collapse everything to one class of share. But open for conversation. The next thing is, well, the share structure. That's the thing that we need to talk about, how that share structure works, and whether or not people can be in, basically back to Heather's question about what's the board composition. So we have our shares, but then we also have our membership classes, and the membership classes affect how the board composition. So those are, I think, the kind of the meaty part of the conversation. Do the share structures, how do we want the shares to work? And how do we want the board to work? So what are the membership classes? And then what Becca was adding on to that, do we want something special for the early the early people. So anyhow,
There's
I think
quorum.
that's a list. Hmm?
Something about quorum, I think, was also one of
Oh, right. Yeah, there's something about quorum, and what I did around that was the way we had it established is we had the same for all meetings. And what I put in the most recent draft it's my proposed solution for circles for kind of regular business meetings, it's 3. It's not a percentage, it's 3 people. And in part because at least 3 people, there's some diversity there. But because our policy is, first of all, many of our circles are only 5 people anyhow, and 4 or 5 people. And the way we have it written, the meeting recording, because people have 48 hours to voice an objection, even if they're not at the meeting, they still have a say in the meeting. And anybody who responds to the email would be part of quorum. So we can set the bar very low. And then for the other meetings, I think I just put it at 51%. And we could figure out for the AGMs and that sort of thing. We probably want to talk through that number. But for the circles, I think the quorum can be very light. And then we just have to address the, kind of the AGM kind of meeting. So I'll list that here and I will continue to pass it on to Heather.
Wow. Yeah, I was listening and I'm not sure how much I have to add. My comment was like organizations having a share. Um, and I don't think that we've talked about that. When we think about shared structure, we think like a family or whatever, which is a really obvious thing. I don't have any attachment to it, but it might be that like-minded organizations might want to add support and maybe even funding if
Yeah. They
that's
can, right now we have it written so organizations can be members,
okay. So that
can be
answers.
natural persons or organizations.
Okay, excellent. I just wasn't sure about that part. Um, yeah, I think at this point that I can just pass. We've kind of covered everything, I think, for me. Um, I just want to see how it rolls out. I think I'll have a lot to say once we have like sort of um, uh, taken all this information and have a new draft, basically is the way I see the next step for it. And yeah. So over to Roland for any more comments.
So agreed on adding the discussion around founder rights and protections. I'm curious to talk about that. And yeah, agreed around the nested co-op model, and yeah, willing to explore that more. I guess, to Becca's point, there's a number of things here that we could talk about, and it might be worthwhile sort of putting them in an order of priority. Where do we want to start? Maybe not even priority, but rather which one is the most top heavy to handle, and that might affect the subsequent topics. So over to Becca.
Yeah, I mean, with 20 minutes left, I'm wondering if there's a couple of the short, easy ones we could, or maybe there's only one left. I don't know, the geographic region one. Um, I mean, because I'm in agreement about joint membership is good, but as long as we stick to the footprint idea, and although I realize I don't really understand how concrete that number is. Like it seems like depending on the agricultural methods in use, it could be different. So I'm curious about that. But I trust you guys
Mhm.
about it. So, um, um, and I just want to also make sure that it's on Ben's to-do list to actually send Bill and Elliot the invite to the April 4th meeting if we are going through with that, if we are planning to go through with that time with them. Over to Ben.
I'm split attention because I'm trying to catch up on notes. The fair share footprint, I will say, is independent of any techniques used on the land. It's a measure of the nature of the land itself. So it doesn't refer to, you can have zero productive capacity on a footprint. So it's simply a measure of, in a particular bioregion, the number of hectares of forest, uh, grazing land, productive agricultural land, and developed land, and food fishery. So it's basically just saying if it's a forest and it's in the Pacific Northwest, 1 hectare equals, 1% or whatever. And then how you use it is the interesting part of the experiment. So in a way, yeah. Um, yeah. Uh, I'm not sure how, I don't know what we need to do to kind of ensconce that more than to say it's kind of an ideal, you know. Um,
Part of
I
the
guess,
maybe
sorry,
it's
go ahead.
part of the definition of not exploiting the land.
Yeah. I think, and that is, I've been thinking about writing a piece on fair share ethics because it really is more in part of like what Roland was saying. We are not living, none of us, I am sure, even though many of us are living kind of low on the consumption scale, are probably living within a fair share. So it's aspirational that we try to move towards living within a fair share, but we don't even know if that's possible right now. What level of comfort is possible. So that's part of the experiment of it. I feel like really the meaty part here is just figuring out what we want to do about the membership on the board. I feel like that's the one that's the trickiest question. And um, yeah, and how much do we want to tie that to the idea of 16 fair share footprints and one property and all that kind of stuff? And I'm not sure if I don't know if now is the right time energy wise for, getting into that. So, but we do have one more meeting. So I guess that's the question. If we are aiming for April 4th, then what are the next steps? I'm going to turn our attention to that question. We've got one more meeting scheduled between now and when we meet with the lawyers again. We also have some opportunities to run things past other folk if we want to. So yeah, what I'm going to propose is, as one next step, let's be clear on what our key questions for the next meeting are and how we want to talk through that. And I guess also, are there any things that we can do in advance of that meeting? Any of these smaller questions to finalize. So that's my first offering on next steps. Over to you, Heather.
Yeah, what I put in the thing is that I'm wanting founders' rights to honor the needs of Ben and Roland. I think that you're the key, partnership that has initiated this, is moving it along, is putting your own time and money into it. I don't feel like I'm kind of a founder in the same category that you are. And I think that, so that's a question for me. And how we do that, actually, I think mirrors is a model for how other people do it too. When I'm looking at a mirror who's purchased the land and whatever it is, it's like, how do we honor that in a way that makes sense for the two of you moving forward and aging in place or whatever it is, however you want to continue to live your life. And not to be shy or reticent or humble or whatever. Just, and if you need some help to think it through, to feel it through, what makes fair to you? So that's a question that I have. Another question, I guess, that I have too is that I'm still not really clear about the sociocratic model and how that relates to the board. So I just, maybe that's me educating myself a bit more about that, but I don't see a board external to the organization, but
Right.
it's internal. And so how that internal flow moves in a simple way, Ben, so that other people can understand it, would be very helpful. Yeah. And it's over to Roland.
What in terms of next steps, I'm I'm thinking of just my experience of meetings and preparing for meetings. And it's, again, I'm coming back to picking what we want to talk about when, and what are easy wins and what are more in depth, and maybe mixing it up. In terms of the fair share footprint, Ben talked about it as it being part of the experiment, and that is, we've proposed 16 footprints on this property, and that the 10-year experiment is um, uh, proving that, is it enough or is it not enough? Can we feed more than, can we supply more than 16 footprints, or less, as part of a larger thing? But that's feels like that's one of the challenging squishy bits, for people who want to have something definite right now, which is so far from the way that I think of things. Then I don't, that's part of the challenge, is how to include squishy things like that. Yeah, so I'm going to keep it like that. And part of the question around what next steps is, what can we do offline, and what can we do in the meeting? Are there preparatory things that we can do, or working other than meeting together? So over to Becca.
I want to second what Heather said about taking care of Ben and Roland as core founders. And especially thinking, I think one way to think outside of the tendency to self-deprecate or be humble or whatever is, if this is going to be a sustainable model for other people, it needs to take care of other people in your role.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that, I don't know, that could be something you two could think about, maybe without us for a while, and then get feedback from us on. I'm not sure, or if that needs to be if that is better as a group conversation. I think a piece of work that would be relatively easy for me to do before the next meeting with the lawyers would be to dig out all that stuff about from the accountants and send it to the lawyers and say,
Mm.
please, which maybe I did before. I don't even have to remember whether I did, but if not, send it to them, and if so, re-ask the question like, what's up with this? And the geographic question thing, like, I don't feel like I have an opinion about. So if the three of you want to meet to talk about it, I'm totally good with that. So yeah, those are the things I have right now over to Ben.
Yeah, I will say that framing this in terms of it's a model, and so we need to think about the model helps that whole founder question for me. Um, and it's, and actually, Roland bringing it back to the, yeah, kind of what's the core thing here? And I feel like maybe I don't have the, I'm going to bring us back to what are the key. So how does this relate to next steps? Is you know, if we write this, the original idea was we were looking for people who could invest in a 10-year experiment. And the investment was for the the fair share sponsors was to make the land available to people who wanted to work it using regenerative techniques for 10 years. And the interest on that was paid based on the social benefit on actually working on creating the lifeboat. And I think I think we can clarify that now where it's almost like as an investor, you're paying a staff to build a lifeboat that you could then move to. So over the 10 years, the core team, the early, you know, group are developing the land and the community. It's kind of that insurance policy idea. And so the original idea was it's a 10-year investment. And your only option for the first 10 years, if you want to take your money out, is you have to find somebody else who can take over your investment and do a transfer, and that would be fine. And if it's bust in 10 years, we sell the property and you get your investment back as like a real estate investment because you're getting whatever the value of the property is after that. And so it's kind of, it was originally intended as a bet you can't lose, because if it's successful, then it is an economically productive lifeboat that you can participate in, and it's viable and sustainable. And if it's not viable, we you know, we pull the plug and you get your money back. And that's a very different kind of investment than somebody who is looking for returns along the way. And it's kind of an easy thing to sell, but it also doesn't really create the space for sort of smaller investors who might be more like the timeshare croppers and stuff. So the only reason I'm kind of putting it out there is I'm thinking about how to pitch it to potential investors. And the model is really simple if you kind of treat it as an experiment. But if you're treating it as you're actually getting the community involved from the front, then I think it makes it more challenging to clarify those different categories. You know, the people who are putting the money up front versus the people who plan to stay forever. I think I'm trying to figure out what the core questions are in terms of the board composition. And Heather, I think that the sociocracy is already integrated in there. And so the board is composed of the members, and really the only role of the board of the Stewardship Council is at the AGM, they are the ones who make the financial determination about surplus. So they set dues if the dues are required, and they determine how the surplus is distributed. And beyond that, all they do is approve the circle plans and then hand them back to the circles for the circles to do what they've been doing. And then the coordination circle is the day-to-day operations, and that actually reflects the circles, not the board.
Right, right. It's the same.
So
Foodlands
yeah,
is the same way, structured the same way. Okay, get it.
yeah. So I think that sociocracy is in there as well as it needs to be.
Okay.
Anyhow, so what one more round on what do so right now, one of the things I will send an invite to Bill and Elliot for including them in the fourth, and we'll use that as a milestone, right? So we want to get all of our ducks in a row so that hopefully at that meeting on the fourth, we can say, what do you need to do to make this happen? And so one of the things that we need to talk about at the next meeting is the founder needs. And I guess the other thing that we need, I agree on the geography. I don't have a strong feeling on the geography question either. I feel like we could just say, Pender, SGI, CRD, and, pick one. And, but I think the share structure and board structure, we want to make sure that we're clear on that. And what else do we need to, do we have everything else on the next steps list? Over to you, Heather.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see you in terms of my schedule, what I might bring forward. And we are meeting again on the 21st. So I mean, maybe just for me to have a conversation with you, Ben, about like how can we report this progress to Foodlands for response at the appropriate circle. And I mean, what we are doing in Lifeboat really should be reported, I think, to the networking circle because we are part of the network. So that would be one thing. We have a guiding general circle too that's like more like your stewardship, not the stewardship. Your what do you
Coordination circle.
coordination? That's the operational circle in the same
Yeah.
way the guiding general circle is a operational circle. And so that maybe that there's something there to be said with that. I don't know about how I want to proceed with the grant application for the Lao Foundation. But I'm just keeping this awareness in the back of my mind so that I can bring it forward. I mean, maybe there are some questions that we have that could be entered into a grant application that could get some support for what we're doing here at Lifeboat. But I don't know about that yet. And that's why I'm thinking maybe there's a conversation between you and I, Ben, about that.
Mhm.
Sometimes I see in the moment the connection, and then when I'm in an agenda, I forget to either put it into the agenda or I'm in the moment and I don't remember all the threads. So I think that's good for me.
Okay.
And I guess Roland is next.
I have nothing to add. This looks like a good list. And I wanted to say, I seem to remember that the whole question of sociocracy in the bylaws was that we had decided not to put in sociocracy explicitly, but rather through the description of how things work. And then that ended up getting a little bit split between the bylaws and the operating manual. So that's my memory of how that all sort of worked out. So over to Becca.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we should have somewhere a running document of what are outstanding questions for the lawyers. And that we can maybe cull from these notes and then also add to next time. And I have a little bit of a feeling of like when we're talking about classes and the board, like maybe we just have that conversation with the lawyers because I'm not sure that it's. I'm back to the feeling of mucking around in the dark a little bit. Like we could say all kinds of stuff, but then they could say, "Oh, well, that doesn't work because this," or or that's required already. So, I'm not saying there's nothing to talk about next week, but I'm not sure that. And maybe there's things we can say about it, about what we. But also, I feel like it would be okay for the four of us to disagree in front of the lawyers. Not necessarily all have to have our ducks completely in one row, especially if we don't even know what's a legal row and what's not. So,
What's a legal duck?
yeah. Yeah, or maybe we're allowed to have ducks and geese in the same row. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't have anything more clear to say other than those things. Over to Ben.
Cool. I like that. I like the idea of like a shared document with the questions, and I have notes. So I think I've got that already. I'll just put it in like a Google. I have it in my own note system and not in Google. And but that also, I think then that answers the question of kind of what can we get done before the next meeting? Because I think we can just do sort of like proposed answers and see if there's agreement on that document. And yeah, this feels like, and I also think I think there's a split the difference with the share structure part for the lawyers, and I think it comes back to what are the values, sort of what is it we're hoping to accomplish with it, and are we clear on that? And I think if we're clear on that, then working out the details is, it's working out the details. So it might just be like kind of revisiting conceptually how we're thinking of it.
Yeah, and what our questions are.
Yeah.
So Ben, one of the things I'd forgotten to say in my round is that I am totally support of a really strong purpose, intention, value statement at the beginning. I think that can last beyond our lives. Is we forget the foundational intention is often forgotten. And if that's in the Constitution or whatever it is, I would really support that. So if you can start to write that, that would be good.
That suggests one of the things to do before the next meeting is all of us review the current document because I think it's in. Is it strong enough? Is a good question.
That's a good point. Yeah. So maybe if you could send that out again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I can put that in that same document. So I'll try to cluster all that stuff in one document and then send a link to that, and then we can use that as one point of reference.
Yeah, and what the lawyers are continually telling us, is at least what I've taken away, is that we need to be really strong about our intention, and they'll figure out how, this is what's so great about them is working with bands, my God, who have a completely different culture, and then trying to see, as long as those bands are really strong about what their culture is. So that's our role. And their role is to try and figure out how they can create a legal document that will reflect that.
Yeah. And I think that I think this points to kind of, Heather, you were talking about the protecting the corporation. And again, where I think the exemption can actually be a strength rather than a weakness, because we don't want investors who don't share the values.
Yes.
So we want to be as clear as possible about, and it's, we don't want to hurt investors. We want to make sure that investors also are treated as people and are made whole and, don't have a burden, but we also want to make sure that it's no privilege. There's no special protection for financial investors, but there is due consideration. And I think that's where, so we want to discourage somebody who thinks they're going to get in on the ground floor and make $1 million.
Yeah.
You know,
And that's what cooperatives are all about.
yeah. So
That
we're
is
that we
totally
have that
cooperatives
advantage. Yeah.
are about. Yeah.
All right. I feel like we've gone a little bit over time, but this seems like it's been really, really productive. So I was going to do one last round or something, Roland.
I just wanted to make a request. If you're going to be sending out the link to the document again, is there a way of indicating the version? Because
It's in the title.
it's in the title. Okay,
Yeah, I've been trying to do version control, and then people will
cool.
copy it and they'll add a little, so and so note. But yeah,
Cool.
and
Just because I've been hearing, people not being sure which version they're looking at.
the part of the problem is that it's not like a Google document where it's in one place and people will make a copy and then they'll share a copy as opposed to making the changes. That's what's happened so far, is that people have saved a copy and
Okay.
then made comments, and then we've got 2 different things or 3 different
And
things.
the reason I did that was because it was making me opening it was changing the numbering.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
And I think Elliot did it and it's not a problem, because we can always, there's a version control sort of built into it, but
Okay.
but yeah, trying to
I
be
don't know how
clear.
these things work. I just thought I would mention it to make things easier.
I just put the date on the top.
Yeah. All right. I think we're good, and let's just do a closing round. So last thoughts for the good of the cause. Over to you, Heather.
Oh, thank you so much for being who you are in this space. I feel really encouraged. Roland.
Take care of yourselves. It is just practical, because the more you take care of yourself, the more you can do. And yeah, so over to Becca.
I just finished reading a novel called The Great Transition. I recommend. It's by Nick Fuller Googins, and it's related. It's about, sort of post-climate crisis society. If you like that kind of thing. I found it somewhat hopeful.
Great. I need that.
Yeah. Yeah, yep. Yeah, that's my last thought is I am trying to be really careful about my news consumption, and the times they are crazy, and how do we keep ourselves sane? So, and I think that's actually, I'm reminding myself and I'm reminding all of us, it feels like we're going crazy because we're going through crazy, but we're not crazy. So it's easy to, like Heather, your thing about, am I, is this really, am I seeing things clearly? We will never know. The times are just crazy, and we're as sane as you get. For
And
better
we'll
or for
stick
worse.
together. We'll stick together, right? And remind each other that we're sane.
That's right. We can do a check-in every once in a while. Did you see that elephant?
Was
Which
that
one?
an elephant?
The one floating.
Oh,
Anyhow,
no.
keep the
Yeah.
faith, y'all.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.